Have you ever seen a man who carried so much history in his silence, it made the room quieter just by his presence? Not because he demanded it, but because something in the way he sat, the way he held his glass, steady, despite the tremor in his hand, told you, this man has lived through things you wouldn't dare interrupt. Rick's taproom had the kind of lighting that didn't pretend to hide the years. Brass fixtures dulled by time, a jukebox that hadn't worked in 5, maybe 6 winters, and booths where the leather had given up trying to stay smooth. It was a Friday night like any other. Half the town's regulars were drifting in, shaking off the cold, chasing something familiar at the bottom of a glass. At the third stool from the far end of the bar sat Frank Delaney. Same stool every week. Same time. Same drink, a dark stout poured slow and steady, head just right. No foam spill. He never looked up when it was placed in front of him. He didn't need to. His fingers closed around it like muscle memory. His eyes stayed fixed on nothing and everything at once, like a man watching a different kind of weather. Frank never raised his voice, never asked for company. But if you stayed long enough, you noticed, no one sat in the stool to his left. Not by rule, not by sign. Just something unspoken. Like the space belonged to someone, or something, that hadn't arrived yet. That night, laughter echoed from the corner booth. Loud, careless, the kind that leans just close enough to cruel. A new group, men who didn't know better, or maybe didn't care to. One of them looked toward Frank, smirked. Said something under his breath, loud enough for it to travel. The others chuckled, not because it was funny, but because it was easy. Frank didn't flinch. He just raised the glass to his lips, steady as ever. The bar was warm. But the air around that third stool suddenly felt colder. Not because of what was said, but because of what was not. Frank Delaney didn't walk like someone trying to make an impression. He walked like a man who had already done more than enough for one lifetime, and now just wanted to make it to his stool without spilling his drink or needing help. That kind of walk, slow, deliberate, uneven, tells you more about a person than any words ever could. It wasn't just age that slowed him down. It was the way he shifted his weight from foot to foot, as if one side of his body carried a little more pain than the other. He moved with the quiet stubbornness of someone who had spent decades relying on nothing but his own legs, even when they betrayed him. The cane he used wasn't fancy. It wasn't polished. Just a sturdy, darkwood staff with a grip worn smooth by time and use. He didn't lean on it like it was weakness. He used it like it was muscle. When Frank arrived that evening, no one greeted him. Not because they didn't notice, but because he didn't ask for it. The regulars gave a subtle nod. Mason, behind the bar, poured his stout before Frank even sat down. No words exchanged. Just the kind of ritual built from years of repetition. Respect lived in the silence. But tonight, something felt off. The group in the back corner was louder than usual. Outsiders. Not unfamiliar to the town, but unfamiliar to this kind of quiet. They'd already run through a couple of pitchers. The kind of laughter that bounces off walls and doesn't check where it lands. One of them nudged the other and tilted his chin toward Frank. Bet he just shows up for the military discount, the man said. His voice wasn't angry, just careless. Like someone poking a wound without knowing it was there. Frank didn't turn. Didn't respond. He just adjusted his seat, took another sip, and stared straight ahead. Mason paused, drying a glass halfway. He looked toward the corner, then back at Frank. Thought about saying something. Then didn't. Another laugh came from the group, sharper this time. Guy probably hasn't heard a compliment since Nam. A beat passed. Frank set his glass down, perfectly centered on the napkin. His hand, steady. Not because he didn't feel the words, but because he'd long since learned how to carry that kind of weight. He glanced to his left. The stool next to him was empty, as it always was. But tonight, for just a second, his eyes lingered there, like he remembered someone who used to fill it. And then he did what he always did. Sat still. And let the room forget how loud it had been just moments before. The room had always held a kind of quiet understanding. Rick's taproom wasn't fancy, but it had its rhythm. Locals knew when to talk and when to let the jukebox fill the silence. Conversations stayed low, laughter never lingered too long, and certain stools were left alone out of respect. But that night, that rhythm broke. The men in the corner weren't regulars. They knew the bartender by name, Mason, but not much else. They wore matching jackets from some plumbing convention a few towns over, and their words grew looser with every pour. What started as whispers became volume, and what started as teasing turned sharp. One of them pointed toward Frank's table. Not openly, but careless enough that the motion didn't need words. Another leaned in and said, "Looks like the guy's one sip from falling over. Somebody check if he's even awake." The line got a laugh. Louder than it should have been. Mason dropped the towel in his hand. His fingers tightened around the edge of the bar, knuckles pale. But he didn't move. He glanced at Frank, still sitting still, glass untouched now, hand resting flat on the wood. A woman at the end of the bar, Deborah, shifted uncomfortably. She had been coming here for years. She looked at Mason, then at Frank, then at the group. Her mouth opened, then closed again. Whatever she wanted to say didn't make it past her throat. Then one of the men stood up. He was younger than Frank by decades, but walked like he had something to prove. He sauntered over, not directly to Frank, but close enough to be felt. As he passed behind him, he leaned down just enough to be heard. "Don't take this the wrong way, old-timer," he said, voice dipped in mock kindness, "but if that cane's just for show, you ought to leave it at home." Frank didn't turn. He didn't flinch. But he did something no one expected. He reached for his cane, placed it across his lap, and held it there, both hands resting gently on the handle. Not protectively. Just firmly. Like someone drawing a line no one could see, but everyone could feel. The man paused. Something in the air shifted. But only for a moment. Then he smirked, turned back toward his table, and let out a chuckle. The jukebox kept spinning a slow country song. Mason stayed behind the bar. Deborah looked down at her drink. And the room, the one that used to know better, just let it happen. At the far end of Rick's taproom, tucked into the corner where shadows fell thicker than the rest of the room, a man had been watching. Not watching like a bystander. Watching like someone who'd seen these kinds of moments before, too many times, in too many places. Colonel Matthew Kane had come in 20 minutes earlier, alone, quiet. He hadn't ordered a drink. Just sat down at a small table near the wall, back straight, eyes forward, as if posture still mattered even without the uniform. But anyone who'd ever served could tell, he didn't need the ribbons on his chest to be noticed. Some men just carried rank in their presence. He had observed everything. Every laugh. Every jab. Every silence that followed when someone should have spoken and didn't. When the last insult dropped, about the cane being just for show, his fingers closed around the brim of his cap. He didn't rush. Just stood. Slowly. Purposefully. Like a man standing to honor a flag. The room didn't react at first. Too much beer. Too much comfort. But Mason saw him. And Mason stopped wiping the bar. Colonel Kane walked toward Frank. Not fast. Not slow. Just steady. He didn't say a word. Didn't look at the group in the corner. Didn't scan the room for approval. He walked past every table until he reached the one next to Frank's. Then he bent down, lifted the cane from Frank's lap, and carefully placed it upright, resting it against the bar beside Frank's chair, just as it had been before the trouble started. Frank didn't move. Kane then took one step back, and stood at attention. Not beside Frank. Behind him. Straight-backed. Hands at his sides. Heels clicked together in silent solidarity. It wasn't a performance. It wasn't loud. It was military stillness. The kind that doesn't ask for attention, but commands it anyway. It took a moment before people noticed. Then the noise died down. first at the bar, then at the tables. Even the jukebox seemed to pull back. Someone from the corner muttered, "What's his problem?" No answer. Kane didn't blink. Frank turned just slightly, catching the Colonel's reflection in the mirror behind the bar. There was no surprise in his eyes. No smile. Just recognition. Mason stepped forward but didn't speak. Nobody did. Because in that moment, everyone in that room understood something without it being said. This wasn't about drinks or jokes or pride. This was about something earned. Something carried. And the man standing behind Frank Delaney wasn't there for show. He was there because sometimes, you don't speak for a man like Frank. You just stand with him. And that's all the room needed to remember what respect looks like. No one moved. Colonel Kane remained at attention behind Frank's chair, his posture unwavering. Frank hadn't turned. He hadn't said a word. The only sound in the room was the quiet hum of the overhead lights and the soft whir of the refrigerator behind the bar. The group in the corner started to feel it first. The weight of being seen. Not called out. Not shamed publicly. But seen, for exactly what they were. One of them, the one who had made the comment about the cane, shifted in his seat. He reached for his beer, found it half warm, and set it back down without drinking. The laughter from earlier seemed distant now, like something they weren't sure had happened out loud. A second man mumbled, "We didn't mean anything by it." His voice barely reached the next table, but in the stillness, it carried anyway. Kane didn't respond. He didn't need to. Frank continued looking forward, his hands folded gently in his lap. His cane, now resting beside him again, was untouched. Not because he didn't need it, but because right now, the man standing behind him was enough. Deborah slowly set her glass down. Her eyes moved between the two men, one seated, one standing, and for the first time that night, she said something. Some things, you just don't mock. It wasn't loud. It wasn't pointed. It was just honest. Like something a mother would say at a dinner table when someone crossed a line too far. Mason took a breath. Then another. He reached under the bar and pulled out a clean towel, not because anything needed wiping, but because his hands didn't quite know what else to do. He didn't say anything either. Frank finally moved. Slowly, he reached for his glass, lifted it, and took a single sip. Then he set it back down, perfectly centered on the napkin again. When he spoke, his voice was soft. Not weak, just calm. "Next time," he said without looking up, "think before you speak." That was it. Not a threat. Not a lecture. Just a line drawn in plain, human language. One of the men at the corner table stood. Not the loud one. A younger guy, quieter until now. He walked a few steps toward Frank, hesitated, then stopped short. "Sir," he began, his voice unsure, "well, I didn't realize who you were." Frank looked at him then. Just for a moment. "You still don't," he said. Then he turned back to his drink. The man nodded, swallowed hard, and returned to his seat without another word. The bar stayed quiet. Because in that moment, everyone in Rick's taproom understood that some shames don't need yelling. They only need silence, long enough to feel what you should have seen from the start. A week later, Frank walked into Rick's taproom just like he always did, Friday evening, 7 o'clock sharp, steps slow but steady. The room didn't stop when he entered, but it shifted. Conversations softened. Heads turned just long enough to acknowledge him, then turned back like nothing happened. But something had. His usual stool was waiting. But tonight, it looked different. Mason had polished the bar along that stretch until the wood gleamed. And just above where Frank's cane usually rested, a small brass plaque had been installed. Simple engraving. Nothing dramatic. Reserved for Sergeant Frank Delaney, still standing. Frank paused. His eyes didn't widen. His mouth didn't move. He just looked at it for a long moment. Then looked at Mason. The bartender gave a nervous smile and shrugged. Thought it was time, he said quietly. Folks ought to know. Frank didn't answer right away. He walked to the stool, adjusted the cane against the counter, and sat down like he always did. No ceremony. No announcement. He nodded once, barely noticeable. Appreciate the gesture, he said finally, his voice calm. But you didn't have to do that. Mason leaned in a little, his voice low. Maybe not. But we should've. There was no applause. No speech. Just the subtle shift in atmosphere that comes when something overdue is finally set right. Across the room, Deborah raised her glass toward Frank. He nodded back. A few others followed suit, no clinking, no toasts. Just lifted glasses, held for a breath, then sipped in silence. Frank didn't smile. But his hand settled gently on the edge of the plaque, like you'd rest your hand on the shoulder of an old friend. And that was enough. From the corner booth, one of the men from the previous week sat alone now. Not drinking. Not talking. Just watching. His friends hadn't come back. Or maybe they had, and chosen not to sit with him. Either way, he stayed quiet. After a few minutes, he stood and walked to the bar. He stopped beside Frank's stool, not too close. Eyes lowered. I was out of line, he said. Frank didn't look at him. I got a father, the man continued, served in Desert Storm. He'd be ashamed of me if he saw how I acted. Frank gave the man one brief glance. Not sharp. Not soft. Just steady. Then maybe don't make him ashamed twice. The man nodded, took a breath, and turned to leave. Frank turned back to his beer. Took a slow sip. Then reached for his cane and tapped it gently against the floor, just once. He didn't care about plaques. What mattered was the line that had been drawn, and who had chosen which side to stand on. It started with one man. Gray beard, denim jacket with an old unit patch on the sleeve, boots scuffed from more than just the weather. He came in the following Friday, looked around, and without a word, took the stool beside Frank's. He didn't introduce himself. Didn't shake hands. Just gave Frank a nod, like they were already mid-conversation and didn't need to start over. The week after, another showed up. Vietnam vet. Quiet eyes. Sat 2 seats down, left a space between them out of respect. Frank didn't say much. But when Mason poured the new guy a beer and slid it down the bar, Frank nudged the coaster closer. That was enough. By the 3rd week, Rick's Taproom had found its rhythm again, but a new one. More measured. More watchful. Every Friday, a few more would come. Not all of them veterans. Some were just older men who understood silence. Understood what it meant to carry things inside and not show the weight on your face. They didn't crowd the bar. They didn't try to turn it into something it wasn't. They just came, and sat. Colonel Kane returned too. Not in uniform. Civilian clothes. A ball cap low over his brow. He never made a scene. Just sat a few stools down, always watching Frank's back like it was second nature. One night, Mason leaned in and asked Frank if he wanted that part of the bar roped off, maybe make it official. Frank just looked at him. Not a monument, he said. Just a seat. Mason nodded. Understood. Deborah started coming in earlier. She'd sit on the far end, order a glass of red, and watch the whole thing unfold like a play she'd seen rehearsed her whole life, but finally getting it right. Even the younger crowd took note. The ones who used to talk loud, play darts too hard, slam shots like they had something to prove, they started holding the door when one of the older men walked in. Started watching their volume. Some even stayed longer just to listen. Frank never changed his routine. Same time. Same drink. Same place. But everything around him had shifted. Because respect, once forgotten, had found its way back into the room. Not through speeches. Not through shouting. But through the quiet act of showing up and sitting down. And somewhere in that stillness, something sacred settled. A kind of peace. The kind that doesn't need to be named to be felt. Frank Delaney didn't show up that Friday. At first, no one said anything. It wasn't unusual for an old man to have an off week. Maybe the weather was acting up. Maybe he had an appointment. Maybe he just needed a night in. But by the time 7:15 came and went, and his stool sat untouched beneath the plaque, something in the air began to change. Mason cleaned the same glass twice. Deborah kept glancing toward the door between sips of her wine. Colonel Kane arrived a few minutes later, hat in hand. He stopped short when he saw the empty seat. No one filled it. No one dared. At 7:30, Mason quietly poured a dark stout. The same one Frank always ordered. He placed it gently on a fresh napkin, directly in front of the empty stool. Then he stepped back, folded the towel in his hands, and stood still. Across the room, conversations faded. A man halfway through a story let the words trail off. A couple near the jukebox didn't select the next song. Even the TV above the bar, normally running sports highlights, now played to no one. The silence didn't ask for attention. It just arrived. Settled in. And stayed. Colonel Kane approached the stool. He didn't sit. He rested his hand on the bar, next to the untouched glass. His voice was low, almost a whisper. He passed this morning. There was no gasp. No dramatic response. Just the collective sound of people absorbing something they had quietly expected, but weren't ready to hear. He died at home. Peacefully, Kane added. VA nurse said he still had his boots by the bed. And his cane leaning on the dresser. Mason nodded. He reached for the light switch over the bar, dimmed it just enough to soften the room. Then he took a small American flag from behind the register, one that had been folded and kept in a case since his father's funeral years ago, and placed it beside the glass. Deborah stood. Walked over slowly. She didn't speak. She just reached out and placed her hand on the back of Frank's stool. Held it there for a moment. Then let go. Others followed. Some veterans. Some not. No line formed. No announcements made. Just a quiet procession of respect. One by one, they came and stood by the glass. Some nodded. Some whispered thank you. Some said nothing at all. The last to approach was a young man. Early 30s, maybe. He looked unsure of his place in the room. But he had been coming more often lately. Had started listening more than talking. He stood there for a long time. Then said, almost to himself, I never knew him. But I wish I had. Colonel Kane looked at him. You still can, he said softly. Start by sitting. The man blinked. Then pulled out the stool beside Frank's. Sat down. Folded his hands. And stayed. That night, no one touched the glass of stout. No one cleared it away. It remained, full and undisturbed, until closing time. Because in Rick's Taproom, for all its history, all its weathered walls and unspoken rules, that glass was more than a drink. It was a presence. A memory. A last gesture from a man who never needed applause to be remembered. And in the silence he left behind, people learned, maybe for the first time, how to honor someone by simply holding space. In a world that often rewards noise, flash, and instant recognition, Frank Delaney reminded us of something far more enduring, the quiet power of dignity. He never asked to be noticed. He never demanded respect. But through steady ritual, silent strength, and unwavering presence, he earned a place no plaque could ever fully capture. At Rick's Taproom, his story unfolded not through grand gestures but through small, human choices, a cane held firmly, a glass raised in silence, a stool left empty out of honor. This wasn't a story about heroics in the traditional sense. It was about showing up. About the men who came and sat. About how one man's quiet integrity could shift an entire room. And how even after he was gone, the space he created, through humility and quiet example, continued to bring people together. That's the legacy Frank left behind. A reminder that courage doesn't always speak loudly, it sometimes just takes its seat and stays. In our noisy, divided world, who are the people in your life who live like Frank did, quiet, steady, and full of silent strength? Have you thanked them? Sat beside them? Or maybe, stood for them? If this story moved you the way it moved us, we invite you to honor it in the simplest, most powerful way, by sharing it. Like this video, subscribe to Legacy of Courage Stories, and pass it on to someone who still believes in the kind of strength that doesn't need a stage. Because sometimes, the loudest legacy is the one that speaks, without a single word.